Welcome to this third and final part of today's lecture, Lecture 3. And this is part 7 in the lecture series on normative ethical theories, also the final part in which we will discuss a group of theories that are a bit different than the theories we have been discussing so far. We're going to discuss a set of theories that are, on the one hand, the oldest, virtue ethics. This was a theory that was determined, developed by a Greek philosopher called Aristotle. And on the other hand, we're going to look at some of the newest ethical theories that have been developed in the 20th century, so-called feminist, discourse, and postmodern ethics. Let's get to it. So virtue ethics, the first theory that we're going to discuss in this last part of today's lecture, is a very different perspective on ethics than the perspectives that we have seen so far. Because rather than focusing on actions, right, we have looked at the consequences of an action and we have also looked at the motivation for an action, we're now going to look at the character, or let's say the integrity of the person who is making the decision. And this is, in business ethics, actually a relatively new idea that has been recently picked up by various scholars. But these ideas, they actually they trace back to Aristotle, one of the Greek philosophers. So virtue ethics, as I already told you, has been developed by Aristotle, a very famous Greek philosopher that lived before Christ, in the 4th century before Christ. And he was a student of Plato. You might also heard of him. And he was a teacher of Alexander the Great. And he actually wondered, and these are questions that were very typical for Greek philosophers. He wondered, well, how do we become happy? What is a good life that we can live? And what constitutes a good life? And he came up with the idea that if we want to live a good life, right, be a good citizen, participate in the community, live a happy life, then we should develop a good moral character. And I will tell you a bit more about what a good moral character constitutes. So, while previous theories that we have been discussing focus on the moral qualities of our actions, virtue ethics focuses on the moral qualities of our character. And the idea is that we should develop good habits. According to Aristotle, he thought, well, we need to become a good person, and to become a good person, we need to act in a good way. So we should develop habits that allow us to perform certain actions without effort. And if we can do that, we can actually perform those actions well. So we can have a good habit for playing the piano, for studying, for playing soccer, and we can actually practice that, right? We can practice soccer, we can practice playing the piano, and by practicing, by trying to become a virtuous piano player, we will eventually indeed become a virtuous piano player. So we can habitually make good choices, playing the piano, trying to practice, etc. And by doing so, we will also eventually become a good person. And in this path, in working towards becoming a good person, we will also increasingly make good choices. Choices not to overeat ourselves or to drink too much. And we will, well, develop morally good character traits. And we call those character traits virtues. Aristotle really indeed thought of living a good life as a life that consisted of habits, good habits, and he called those habits virtues. You have different types of virtues. On the one hand, virtues that are called intellectual virtues. They have to do with our reason, with our intellect. And also virtues that are moral virtues. And they much more have to do with sort of morally good character traits. And virtues, they help us to make the right choices, right? So you see there is some kind of loop. We want to become a good person. To become a good person, we need to do good things. We need to practice in becoming a good person, studying the piano, playing the piano. And by doing that, we will eventually become virtuous and make the right choices that will again allow us to even become a better person. So the idea is that we are going to make right choices, and by continuously doing that, we will build a good moral character. We will become a virtuous person by acting in a virtuous manner. And this will allow us to make choices that lead to a good life, which was the sort of the ultimate goal that Aristotle was about. So what is actually a virtue? So virtues are the mean or the middle between two extremes. The extremes of deficiency, not having a certain character trait, or excess, having too much of a certain character trait. So here is an example. The middle is courage, which is the virtue. To become a virtuous person, you can be courageous. But this, if you have too much courage, you become reckless. And if you do not have enough courage, you become a coward. So virtues dispose us, right? They enable us to act ethically and not just once, right? You do not become a courageous person by just doing one courageous act, but you need to make this a habit, right? It becomes a virtue once it's really something that is ingrained in your character. It's something that you at some point will just do without effort. So I already told you that for Aristotle, the overarching goal was happiness, right? So developing a virtuous character is part of what it means to live a good life. And this is something that you need continuously to choose for, right? So acting virtuously, you will eventually become a virtuous person. And happiness in that sense, so the good life, if you want to name it, is not just a subjective feeling. It's really something that means that you realize your capacities and potential, your virtues that are already somewhere inside of yourself. You can sort of realize them by acting once over and over again in a courageous or any kind of virtuous way, right? So again, if you want to become a courageous person, you should help out someone who is in need. But only this one choice does not necessarily make you a virtuous person. You need to, every time you see someone who is in need, you need to help them and choose for the courageous option every time and time again. So having a virtuous character, for example, promotes integrity. And if you think about virtue ethics in business, then you can of course question, well, what is a good manager? Or what is a good corporation? And then if you would apply virtue ethics to these questions, you would realize, well, what is a good manager? A manager might be someone who realizes the goals of a business virtuously, someone who is courageous, who is wise, who aspires and helps others. Well, a good manager is not someone who just one time does the good thing, but someone who would continuously avoid greed or careless spending, but is temperate, wise with money, kind, etc., every time and time again. And the same holds for a company, right? You can also have a company whose corporate character is virtuous. And also there it holds that a company cannot just become a good company by acting virtuously once, but it really needs to practice these virtues over a longer period of time for it to become a virtuous corporation. Well, I hope this is clear. Let's continue to the next couple of theories. And I group these theories together because they are, again, quite distinctive from the theories we've been discussing so far. Um, The discussed normative theories that we have been going through in the past couple of lectures, they have been developed centuries ago, right? We now just saw Aristotle, a very ancient philosopher that developed a very an interesting view on ethics that is still used in today's business ethics. And we've also come across a lot of theories that have been discussed and developed in the era of Enlightenment in the 18th century. So more recently, there have also been ethical theories developed in the 20th century. So these are contemporary perspectives on ethics. And these three perspectives, they actually share one sort of common, let's say, criteria, in that they are not a principle-based approach, right? Remember, utilitarianism, ethics of duty, they had one key principle that we can use to determine whether an act is right or wrong. Well, the three perspectives that we're going to discuss in the last, couple of minutes in today's lecture are actually perspectives that take a different criteria in order to decide whether something is right and wrong. So feminist ethics, you might say that that's a perspective that focuses on relationships and responsibility, on networks and social roles. Discourse ethics focuses on norm generation, and postmodern ethics focuses on empathy and moral impulse. So these are really different perspectives on sort of the generation of ethics, on what is right and wrong. So let's have a look at feminist ethics. So as I already told you, feminist ethics is not a principle-based approach towards ethics, but it focuses on relationship type of moral reasoning. So it's not focused on abstract principle, but the starting point is that men and women have very different attitudes towards organizing social life. And this also affects how ethical conflicts are handled. So if you think about fairness or what is actually a right or wrong action, most often these were actually male philosophers that came up with these ideas that there should be a principle that determines whether something is right or wrong. Well, probably their role as a man, as a husband, as a philosopher in a certain time and era also determined how they experienced morality. For feminist ethics, or ethics of care, which is also the other term that's often used to label feminist ethics, we should consider the social rules that structure our moral experience. So the individual is embedded within social structures and interpersonal relations, and we are also responsible for our relationships and the connections we have to other people. Social rules guide our moral experience, you might say. So rather than viewing moral problems as being conflicts of rights, feminist ethics perceives these conflicts as conflicts of responsibilities in relationships. And if we think about sort of moral problems as conflicts in relationships, in the different social roles that people have, then it can actually be solved, a moral problem, by subjective assessments, which give room to empathy, harmony, and care. The main goal for this principle, or for this perspective on ethics, is also to avoid harm and to maintain healthy relationships. And the idea is that we're all responsible for maintaining healthy relationships, and that we can actually also learn from experience, right? Including experience of marginalized communities and minorities, and hearing how they experience morality. So the key elements of ethics of care, and I can imagine that it really is a very different view to morality than the views we have discussed so far, right? There is not one key principle, but you might select a few key elements, and that is that relationships are important, right? So we're always in a context where we relate to others, and the roles that we have with and towards others determine how we view morality. We're responsible for our relationships, right? So we need to be active in taking decisions, and we need to be sort of aware of the responsibilities that we have in that sense. And we can also learn from experience, right? So decisions are affected by our past. In a way, we're path dependent upon the decisions we made and our history, and we can learn from that. And we should definitely also take that into account when solving novel moral problems. Right, so that's ethics of care or feminist ethics. Let's continue to the next theory, which is called discourse ethics. So a discourse is, if you look at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a discourse is the capacity of orderly thought or procedure or a mode of organizing knowledge, ideas, or experience. Right? So a discourse is often like a story of rationalized thoughts that tells us something. It's a way of organizing knowledge. And the idea of, or the idea behind discourse ethics is that norms, moral norms, norms about right and wrong, prescriptions of what is right and wrong, is generated in, well, let's say irrational reflections on experiences. So let's say that people are in agreement or in disagreement about what a correct prescription is. There might be diverging normative principles. We can actually think about, well, what kind of norms are generated in each of these rationales, right? People might have different arguments to decide whether something is right or wrong. Well, discourse ethics invites us to reflect on real life experiences of all participants involved, right? Imagine we're in a community, people disagree about what is right and wrong, and discourse ethics would then invite all the participants to reflect on, well, their norms, their experiences, and start from real life experiences. In such a reflection, the different parties in a conflict, right, they're in disagreements as to what is right and wrong, they should sit together and engage in a discourse, a reflection about the settlement of the conflict. Why do you think about the conflict in such a way? Why do you think it's right? Why do you think it's wrong? And the idea is that eventually sitting together and rationally reflecting on that will provide a solution that should be acceptable to all. In such a discussion, people should be free to have any opinion, so they shouldn't be pushed into an opinion, and they should feel free to propose their own views. Well, you can imagine that this is quite time demanding, right? Sitting together, hearing all people's views. People might be self-interested. So the question, of course, is, can everybody discuss freely and openly? But that is the idea behind discourse ethics. And you might also come up with an example, right? If you think of Facebook, where we have had a lot of conflicts over the past year in terms of privacy, freedom of speech, then you might use discourse ethics to settle the conflict. If you think about free speech regulation, where of course some people would say, well, free speech is the goal. We need to make sure that people are free to say whatever they want. And opposed to that, there might be people that say, well, but sometimes free speech is also harming others, right? So it cannot always be prevailing, as sometimes you also need to respect opinions of others and make sure that you do not harm the feelings of others. Well, if you want to settle in such a conflict, discourse ethics would say, well, consult all the stakeholder groups, everybody involved, hear their stories, hear their experiences, reflect on them, be open, etc. And then probably you will eventually find a solution. Let's continue to the last theory of today, postmodern ethics. And postmodern ethics is yet another perspective. And this perspective actually proposes that there is no such thing as an objective moral truth. Postmodern ethics proposes that morality is not even located in the sphere of rationality, right? Up to now, we have always had some kind of principle that we could think of, we can reflect upon, we can talk about it. There is some sense of being able to decide upon what is right or wrong. But from a postmodern ethical view, there is not such a thing. So they believe that we cannot rationally think and come up with moral principles, right? So morality is located beyond the sphere of rationality. And they view ethics as an emotional moral impulse towards others. So it's as if there is some kind of gut feeling, you might say, that we all have about what is right and wrong. And this is not something that we can rationally uh, rationalize, reflect upon, but it's something that you just feel. It's like an emotional, like an emotion. Postmodern ethics is quite difficult to give examples for because examples are always abstract, right? They are an example, a stylized fact, a case. So they're not much used because they simplify reality. So the idea is here that we should really experience, talk to people to see what kind of moral impulses they have and what kind of experience they have when they are in a given situation. So it's the end of the block on normative ethical theories. So just to summarize, in lecture 2, we started with discussing utilitarianism and ethics of duty, two theories that we categorize as absolute normative ethical theories. And today we continued with 4 different views on ethics, ethical egoism, also an absolute ethical theory. And then we continued from ethical egoism to the theories of rights and justice, where we discussed the theory of John Rawls. And in the last part, we have discussed virtue ethics, feminist discourse, and postmodern ethics. I hope you've enjoyed listening to today's lecture. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussions in class this week. Bye bye.